From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Congressional Budget Office issues a warning about the rising tide of federal debt as President Biden reportedly plans to cancel $10,000 per person in student loans. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and editorial writer Monet Ukwe-Barua. Happy Friday to you both. On Wednesday, the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO, updated its baseline projections for the economy and for federal spending and revenue. Kate, can you just give us some highlights of this report?
Yeah, Kyle. So this is their first update in about a year. And for some of us, we have been really looking forward to it and what assumptions CBO was going to make about, for instance, inflation. But Kyle, I think one of the big takeaways here is that tax revenues are largely very healthy and growing, amount to about 18% of GDP over the budget window, but they simply cannot keep up with spending, which overall comes into more like a quarter of GDP. And to break that down a little bit, I mean, entitlement spending is really just become insatiable and will continue to make up 2/3 of federal outlays over the next 10 years. So this is really the picture, Kyle, is that tax revenues, despite a lot of predictions about lower corporate revenues after tax reform in 2017, revenues are very healthy. It's really that the U.S. has a spending problem. And we can talk more about this as we get into it, but we're seeing interest payments become a new threat to the budget. And we're also going to see debt held by the public soar to rates we haven't even seen in World War II. Well above 100% of GDP. So I got to say, Kyle, it's a little bleak, but, hopefully lawmakers will start to take the fiscal problem seriously because it's a dark picture of the future. And
it's an old point that the U.S. doesn't have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem. But if you want to understand what that really means, there's probably no better place to start than this Congressional Budget Office report. And what we're talking about here is, especially as the economy recovers from the pandemic and with inflation, inflation can be pretty good for government tax revenue, pushes people in states into higher brackets, pushes up capital gains as the assets prices increase and capital gains taxes are not adjusted for inflation. So, Monet, how can you run a country forever if you are raising taxes at something like 18% of gross domestic product and you're spending at something like 24% of GDP?
Well, I think that question answers itself. Eventually, the United States is going to hit a limit in the amount that it can either borrow to sustain the current spending levels or in the amounts that it can tax. Again, we've seen revenue rising healthily, and it's good that at a given tax rate, the government is able to raise more money than it used to in order to cover some of these costs. But we know, again, that costs are rising faster than those revenues. And so the problem is going to get incrementally worse until either sort of Washington comes to its senses or we hit a crisis that forces it to reform. I'm not optimistic about any proactive solution to the problem, especially because I think that over the course of the past couple years, politicians in Washington have gotten much more used to sort of ginormous amounts of sort of liberal and unproductive spending, even compared with what they used to be. I think the lesson that they probably have learned, which will be very hard to get out of, is that sort of voters might still be skeptical of any proposal for a new giant program, something like Medicare for All or the Green New Deal. But as long as you're able to pass off spending as being necessary to address some kind of longstanding problem, you're basically able to do that. And these bills often tend to be quite popular. We saw bipartisan support for the infrastructure bill, which added, over $1 trillion over 10 years to the cost side of the deficit. We saw bipartisan support for a fairly large omnibus bill. We've seen unrestricted borrowing. And so I think it will be even harder than it used to be to sort of make the argument even to Republicans that they need to be proactive about restraining the growth of spending in Washington.
And on the point about the debt held by the public, it's expected to dip a little bit over the next 2 years as some of this pandemic spending expires. But then here's the line from the CBO. It reaches 110% of GDP in 2032, higher than it has ever been, and 185% of GDP in 2052. Moreover, if lawmakers amended current laws to maintain certain policies now in place, even larger increases in debt would ensue. So just to underline that last figure the CBO is citing, that the debt would hit 185% of GDP in 2052, is with some programs that taxpayers are currently enjoying with their scheduled expiration dates coming true, which we know is not how Congress operates. It likes to put these expiration dates on because it makes the bills look cheaper in the short term, and then we get to that fiscal cliff or whatever it is, and a lot of those programs end up being extended. But Kate, what will it take to wake Washington up? It seems like we've been talking about this issue, this growing debt issue, my entire life, and the dates still keep coming sooner. So the latest date for Medicare Trust Fund insolvency is 2026, which is just around the corner.
Right, Kyle. And keep in mind, those entitlement estimates have only been revised in one direction, right? They are only going bankrupt sooner than we would expect, and costs are only going up. So I do think the entitlement spending, CBO is obviously trying to get a good picture of what it's going to look like here, but we can expect it to be revised upward. Kyle, I don't know what it's going to take. I think one thing that should really capture everyone's attention from this report is just the net interest on the debt. And that is, I think, set to double over a decade to a record 3.3% of GDP. And the reason why I might draw your attention to that sort of wonky detail is we spend about 3% of GDP on national defense, and everyone thinks national defense is an enormous expenditure. So we're going to see even more squeeze on our ability to defend ourselves as a country. And I do think that having an expenditure like net interest on the debt compete with that is a really startling reality that hopefully will sink in with the public over some point. But I don't see a lot of reasons to be optimistic in the short term about Congress getting serious about reforming entitlement spending, which is really where all the money is. I mean, we have these fights every year over appropriations bill, but 2/3 of the budget running on autopilot means that you're not really getting to the heart of the problem. I do think it's good news that Build Back Better failed last fall. I think that would be making this picture look much worse. And some of the programs in Build Back Better, they pretended not to be entitlements, but they really were. And so that is, I guess, one bright spot there. But other than that, I don't really see a lot of reasons to be immediately optimistic.
And the interest on the debt, the amount that you have to pay just to service the debt, goes up, obviously, as the amount of the debt goes up, but it also goes up as interest rates increase. And that's a point that Brian Riedel, a Manhattan Institute guy, has been making. I will point to a section of a report that he did in December, and I'll just read a few lines. He says, "What if interest rates exceed CBO's projection? An analysis of CBO data reveals that every percentage point by which interest rates exceed the CBO projected rates would increase government interest costs by $30 trillion over 30 years. He adds that that amount is 1.5 times the size of the entire Social Security shortfall and roughly matches total projected defense spending over that period, unquote. And to the point that Kate makes about the budget competition between discretionary spending and defense spending and entitlements, that's the kind of budget squeeze that we're already seeing. And I think it's only going to get worse, Monet, as we are entering maybe a new Cold War, a more dangerous period. But Americans often look across the water to Europe at the countries that are not meeting their NATO commitment to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And they say, come on, how can you not spend 2% of your GDP on defense? Well, that's the answer to that question, is when you get a budget squeeze like this, then politicians have to make really hard choices. And oftentimes they don't choose to buy the tanks and the planes.
Well, that's right. And we have seen that the war in Ukraine has been something of an exception that has probably put pressure on Democrats to at least sustain levels of defense spending. Obviously, they're spending specific amounts for aid directly to Ukraine, but also it's become harder for them to argue that sort of we are overfunding our military and that we need to make dramatic cuts. But that said, we know that they are always looking basically to try to make cuts when they believe that they can get away with it. I believe President Biden, in his first sort of push for defense appropriations, decided to sort of dramatically cap growth for certain areas, despite complaints from sort of within the Pentagon that a lot of our key programs, and particularly our Navy, is severely underfunded. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, as these cost pressures continue to increase, both in servicing the debt and with additional spending that Congress continues to pass, it's going to get much harder, even for legislators who are more sympathetic to American defense, to be able to come up with the money to keep these programs funded.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, This is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Speaking of the federal debt and federal spending, there has been a debate between Democrats, moderates, and progressives about whether President Biden should unilaterally try to forgive federal student loans, and if so, how much, and what the terms of that could be. And we have some reporting now here on Friday. This is the Washington Post story. White House officials are currently planning to cancel $10,000 in student debt per borrower, and reportedly that would limit debt forgiveness to Americans who earned less than $150,000 last year, or for married couples, less than $300,000. And so we are still awaiting the official announcement from the White House on this. But Kate, that sounds like pretty reliable reporting that that's what President Biden plans to do.
Yeah, I think it is, Kyle. There are just a number of remarkable things about this proposal so far. And one thing that we're seeing is that the suggestion being floated so far is that the debt relief would be available up to married couples filing jointly who earn $300,000 a year in income. It's really hard to overstate how large of an income that is and whether that's, really means tested or targeted relief. There are also a number of unknowns about how any of this is going to work, how you would apply for the forgiveness, whether if you're in college now, you could apply for this forgiveness. For instance, is the forgiveness up to $10,000 going to phase out, meaning as you earn more, you're eligible for less? That has real implications for what your tax rate is, for instance. We have no idea how any of this will work, but we do know that it will largely be a huge benefit for relatively affluent and educated people. And we also know, because we're seeing some of this already, that the progressives who have been pushing Biden to do this and do it by executive action, not to wait for Congress to act, we know that they will not be happy with it. They do not see $10,000 as sufficient. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was already disparaging it on Twitter on Friday. So we know that it's not going to placate the progressives who want him to go much further and ostensibly just simply wipe out the entire portfolio somehow of $1.7 trillion. But we do know that $10,000 for anybody of that high of income would cover a lot of student debt, hundreds of billions of dollars. And there's just so many questions that we could get into, Kyle, about the legality of this or the wisdom of it. But it's a striking proposal that they're serious about going through with this.
But on the point about $10,000, President Biden campaigned on that in his 2020 election. So it's not as if that policy is not something that he never told voters he was intending to do. On the other hand, it really shows, I think, especially as Kate points out, this income limit of $300,000 a year for married couples, it really shows who the modern Democratic Party is aimed at. And remember that about 60% of Americans have some sort of college, even if they didn't get a degree, they went for a year or for 2 years, which means that 40% of Americans do not have any college at all. And those people are truck drivers and oil roughnecks. And is it really fair to tax them to pay off the loans of people who a lot of times are lawyers and doctors? And the Committee for a Responsible Budget has an analysis of this kind of $10,000 forgiveness, means tested. And it says that 24% of the benefit would go to the top 20% of households. 33% of the benefit would go to the next 20% of households. And so most of this money would be going to people who are already in the top half of the socioeconomic structure here in the U.S.
Well, you're right to point out that Joe Biden might have campaigned on the idea of student loan forgiveness and specifically floated that $10,000 number as one that, might be sufficient. But I think there's a big difference between what he says on the campaign trail while he's, sort of putting out proposals for every issue under the sun and what we've seen in the past couple of months when they've really floated it as a policy that might be coming imminently. And I do think that they're basically trying to focus group the policy. They're putting out different proposals. First, it might have been 50,000, then it was cut to 10,000, and they're trying to see how the public is reacting. And so far, it has seemed like a lot of people are very skeptical of this policy, and that's probably because of exactly what you just mentioned. It seems to be something that's tailored at sort of the group that increasingly makes up the Democratic Party's base, and that's relatively affluent and relatively young voters, to the exception of the vast majority of Americans. You're right to point out that most Americans haven't attended college and therefore don't have any college debt. I would add to that, there are quite a lot of Americans who have attended college and then already paid off their debt. And so both of these groups, I think, would be very upset to see this transfer being made from taxpayer coffers directly to this small and relatively affluent group. And just to finish off, yes, the Committee for Responsible Budget estimated that the $10,000 level for student debt forgiveness might cost about $230 billion. That is not a small number. We've been talking about defense spending. I believe that that figure would be somewhere between a quarter and a third of the annual defense budget. And again, it's very different from the types of large bills that Congress usually passes, whether it's the infrastructure bill, whether it's a COVID spending bill, things like that. Usually the government is at least arguing that there's some kind of emergency being addressed or that there's an investment being made, something that would really justify a huge expenditure. In the case of the student loan forgiveness, it's basically just a direct transfer. It is a giveaway to these people. Many of them might be in hard financial positions, but still, it's not as if Americans are going to get a bang for their buck from that $230 billion. It's essentially just a write-off from the federal balance sheet.
On the question of whether the president has the legal authority to do this, there is a memo floating around that the Trump administration's education department, the counsel, deputy general counsel there, wrote, essentially saying that the president does not have the power to do this, that he can adjust some things and maybe pause some things. The pause during the pandemic maybe is the outer edge of his legal authority. But the problem, Kate, is it's not clear to me who would have the standing to sue, because in order to bring a lawsuit in federal court, you have to have a direct injury that is redressable by the court. And there's some legal analysis suggesting that former borrowers would not have standing, taxpayers would not have standing, because it's not as if every time a taxpayer's money is spent in a way that he disagrees with that he can sue. That's not how the federal government operates. Congress maybe would have standing, but also we have a Congress that is controlled by President Biden's party here. And so it's not clear to me that there's a real avenue to bring a legal challenge if President Biden does this. The other point I would make is just the one about incentives, which is if the current crop of student loan borrowers gets $10,000 forgiven now, it seems to be that it makes it much less likely that the next group of student loan borrowers will watch their balances closely. And maybe the point is even more so for the administrators who are setting the tuition dollars. If they think there's more forgiveness coming down the line, then why would they work and scrounge to stop tuition raises? Why not just raise the money and we'll get it back from the feds later?
Yeah, Kyle, I mean, there's a lot there. On your point about standing, I do think, Congress is currently controlled by Democrats, but that may not be the case in the fall. So there may be a way for this to percolate through the courts in some sense. And I think several different entities will try to get standing, given that I do think it would be a pretty egregious abuse of executive authority to just unilaterally forgive this debt. I do think also on your point on the incentives, it really is ironic to watch Democrats suggest what is basically just a huge get out of jail free card for universities, because they basically now don't have to answer for any of the outcomes of their students or why some of these students struggled to pay back their debt if their degrees weren't really valuable. And it really just feeds another system where basically we're allowing colleges to charge as much as they want because they know that federal loans will continue to be more generous. I mean, we've talked about this before here on Potomac Watch, but there's a lot of academic evidence that, for every dollar of student loans, maybe a college raises tuition by 50 cents. And so that terrible dynamic will continue if this is just simply forgiven without any changes to how business is done. You'd also see just individual decision making would not improve either. I mean, think about, you want kids to, when they're considering colleges, to look at a school that is a good return on their investment, to take out loans that they reasonably think they can pay back and pursue a degree that they think will eventually be remunerative. So really, it's just on multiple levels, just a terrible message to send to the industry that they can just keep doing what they have been doing, even though we're seeing now that it just simply hasn't worked.
The last point that I would make about the problem of doing this through unilateral executive action is it obviates any sort of discussion or negotiation about how to change student loans to make them better and to make sure this doesn't happen again. And we have a letter here from a listener, Paul, in Minnesota. He says, in the crisis of 2008, much was made of the predatory lending of mortgage companies. Is not the federal government the student predatory lender? Is there any effort to halt or reform federal government loan practices and guarantees in order to prevent new problem student debt? And Monet, I think the answer to that is no, because President Biden is planning to do this on its own. I mean, at least if there were debate in Congress about forgiving some portion of student debt, you'd think that what would come along with that debate is ideas on how to fix the problem in the first place. And Monet will give you the last word.
Well, that's a great question from the listener. And I think you're right to say that the answer is no, that nothing is being attached to this forgiveness to reform the structure of student loans or put colleges on the hook. We pointed out that the young people who this forgiveness is aimed at are an important constituency of the Democratic Party. Color me cynical, but I would say that the universities are also another important constituency of the Democratic Party, and that President Biden and his allies would be very, very hesitant to sort of include any kind of provision that would restrict universities in what has been a really, really successful revenue model for them. So they're committed to giving this giveaway to student debt holders, but they definitely don't want to do anything that would upset the universities, which is a real shame.
Thank you, Monet and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.